In the final months of the Second World War, the world's greatest armies were not fighting for victory. They were fighting for possession of secrets. Entire divisions vanished behind collapsing fronts. Convoys slipped into fog-bound seas, and orders were issued under code names that never appeared in any archive. Historians speak of surrender and reconstruction. Yet in the shadows of Berlin, Gdansk, and the Baltic depths, a different war continued, one waged for information, technology, and survival. Decades later, fragments of those operations have resurfaced. Damaged field reports, intercepted transmissions, sonar anomalies, and eyewitness accounts long dismissed as delirium. Together, they form a pattern, a story buried beneath the official record, where loyalty blurred and nations traded ghosts for silence. What began as the world's greatest conflict did not end in 1945. It only went underground. Chapter 1. The Ghost Convoy of the Baltic Sea. On the night of January 30th, 1945, snow drifted across the frozen docks of Gotenhafen, now Gdynia. The port, choked with refugees, was lit only by the dull orange of burning oil. Amid the chaos of Operation Hannibal, the massive evacuation ordered by Admiral Karl Dönitz to save civilians and personnel from the advancing Red Army, hundreds of ships departed under confusion and desperation. Yet, among the manifests recorded by the Kriegsmarine, one convoy stands apart. Its existence never officially logged, its cargo never declared. It would later be whispered among surviving sailors as Die Geisterflotte, the Ghost Convoy. At 21:40 hours, 3 merchant vessels, the Hestia, Edda, Thor, and Weserland, slipped their moorings under blackout orders. Their escort consisted of 2 U-boats stripped of insignia and a trawler refitted with radio suppression equipment. Orders came directly from the Abwehrstelle Königsberg, bearing the mark of Oberst Wilhelm von Stegen, an officer later untraceable in post-war records. The convoy's stated destination was the Danish port of Aalborg, but according to a surviving Enigma intercept decrypted in 1957, the ship's real course veered north by northwest, toward neutral Swedish waters. Cargo manifests recovered from damaged warehouses after the war listed nothing under those hull numbers. Instead, Allied post-war intelligence found fragmentary correspondence referring to Special Transport 2706, containing classified scientific material and priority personnel. One note, discovered in the British Zone archives in Hamburg, referenced the extraction of Division A from Thuringia via naval route. Division A, historians now suspect, may have referred to a contingent of SS engineers associated with Project Sonnenrad, an experimental weapons program focused on energy conversion technologies. The Ghost Convoy departed just as the hospital ship, Wilhelm Gustloff, was torpedoed by Soviet submarine S-13. In the confusion of rescue operations, the unidentified vessels passed unnoticed into the storm-heavy Baltic. For decades, Soviet records claimed no engagement occurred beyond that night's tragedy. Yet, in 1963, the son of Captain Alexander Marinesco, the same commander of S-13, testified that his father had logged a secondary contact hours after the Gustloff sinking. The entry, later censored, described a group of vessels running without light, escorted by 2 submerged contacts emitting no identification pings. The next page of the logbook was torn out. In 1978, Swedish marine researchers from the University of Uppsala conducted sonar surveys near Gotland, searching for wrecks from the war. Among the known ships, they recorded 3 anomalies aligned in a perfect triangle, 40 meters below the seabed, covered by decades of sediment. Their shapes matched those of small freighters from the Kriegsmarine Auxiliary Fleet. When researchers attempted to publish the results, the Swedish Defense Ministry classified the images under national security law, citing proximity to sensitive naval training zones. The files were not released until 2003, and even then, the coordinates were redacted. Declassified MI6 notes from the late 1940s reference a German extraction line operating under civilian disguise through Baltic trade routes, facilitated by Swedish intermediaries. One entry, handwritten by a field officer, mentions cargo, metallurgical samples, design portfolios. Personnel from Ahnenerbe, the Ahnenerbe, an SS organization responsible for pseudo-scientific research, had been deeply involved in Nazi technological experimentation and occult studies. If these scientists were among the evacuees, Their disappearance could explain why several research teams later resurfaced in South America under assumed identities. Witness testimony emerged from an unexpected source. A Baltic fisherman named Henrik Larsson, interviewed by Swedish journalist Lars Nyström in 1981. Larsson claimed his father had been at sea near Öland on the night of January 31st, 1945. According to him, they sighted a column of ships moving under complete silence, escorted by something like submarines. He described seeing a faint red light signal, 3 flashes, 1 pause, 3 flashes, an old Kriegsmarine code for mission secure. Minutes later, a distant explosion echoed from the east, followed by what he called a strange blue reflection across the water. The next day, Swedish coastal stations reported temporary radio interference across the entire Baltic sector. No official German records ever mention Hestia, Edda 4, or Weserland again. Post-war ship registries omit them entirely. Yet, a British War Office telegram from May 1945, marked most secret, referenced 3 merchant hulls pending recovery from the Baltic, suspected carrying enemy assets. Recovery never occurred. By the time Allied divers reached the approximate coordinates in 1946, the area had been declared a Soviet exclusion zone. In the 1990s, Polish naval historian Tomasz Kulesza uncovered fragments of Soviet naval dispatches in Moscow's Central Archive. One document labeled Intercepted Enemy Activity 31-01-45 recorded sonar contacts consistent with a convoy heading northwest from Gdansk Bay. The report ends with the cryptic note, "Orders received to disengage. High Command priority extraction in progress." Whether this was an acknowledgement of the ghost convoy's passage or an unrelated encounter remains uncertain. What is known is that the Soviet response was uncharacteristically restrained. Further speculation emerged around the cargo itself. Allied debriefings of captured SS logistics officers referenced sealed containers marked A3R, loaded at the Königsberg railhead days before the evacuation. These containers, according to one Clark, contained experimental drives and documents pertaining to field resonance. American analysts in the 1950s, particularly those attached to Operation Lusty, the Allied program to seize advanced German technology, believed such terms may have referred to prototype power sources intended for aircraft propulsion. Others, more cynically, believed it was gold, art, or stolen medical archives from occupied territories. By 2012, when sonar imaging expeditions again surveyed the Baltic floor for environmental studies, researchers noted metallic interference patterns near the same coordinates once flagged in 1978. Independent divers attempting to access the area reported restricted naval jurisdiction enforced by both Polish and Swedish authorities. One diver, whose footage briefly circulated online before being removed, captured the outline of a corroded hull with a barely visible German eagle stamped near the bow, unmistakably Kriegsmarine design. The shape was consistent with that of a 1944 Hansa-type A freighter. The story of the ghost convoy is more than a maritime mystery. It is an intersection of desperation, secrecy, and survival at the war's end. Every side had something to hide. For the Germans, it may have been the evacuation of knowledge they feared would fall into Soviet hands. For the Allies, it was the question of how much they already knew, and why those records were buried beneath classification seals that remain unbroken to this day. In 2021, a digital historian at the Bundesarchiv uncovered a mislabeled microfilm roll titled Repatriation, Baltic, January 1945. Within it were fragments of communication logs between the Abwehr and Kriegsmarine Coastal Command. One line stood out: Transport 2706 completed. Northern contact established. Await confirmation from recipient H. No record identifies who or what H referred to. Some suggest it could stand for Himmler. Others, more provocatively, believe it signified Helsingborg, the Swedish port allegedly used for smuggling high-value assets into neutrality. Whatever its meaning, the ghost convoy sailed into the dark Baltic night and never returned. There were no survivors, no debris, and no acknowledgements from any government involved. What remains are fragments, sonar echoes, redacted memos, and the enduring silence of the sea itself. Beneath the cold waters off Gdansk lies a question that history refuses to answer. What was so valuable that an empire in collapse risked everything to send it away under the cover of its own destruction? Chapter 2: Operation Eclipse: The Vanished Bunker Files. In April 1945, the streets of Berlin were littered with rubble, punctuated by the distant crackle of artillery from Soviet 1st Belarusian Front units pressing from the east. The city's western sectors were a labyrinth of abandoned Wehrmacht positions, scorched earth and civilian panic. Amid the chaos, SHAF, Supreme Headquarters Allied Expeditionary Force, authorized a covert operation to seize Nazi command centers before they could fall into Soviet hands. The codename was Operation Eclipse, and its aim was precise: capture the remaining technical archives, research blueprints, and high-value personnel housed in subterranean facilities beneath Tempelhof Airport and surrounding districts. What was seized, and what subsequently disappeared, would become one of the most enigmatic chapters of post-war intelligence operations. The initial assault was carried out by the 12th U.S. Army Group's Intelligence Division, supplemented by select OSS detachments under Captain Frank Ellis. Documents recovered at entry points included operational orders from the Wehrmacht's Luftwaffe Research Section and Cryptic Laboratory, logs from SS Projekt Morgenröte, eyewitness testimony from Lieutenant Howard Brenner, who later testified to the Senate Select Committee on Intelligence in 1965, describes descending into an underground complex, reinforced with blast doors 2 meters thick. It was a labyrinth, Brenner recounted, rows of steel vaults with German labels, blueprints of what looked like generators or propulsion systems, and racks of schematics with English annotations in the margins. Within 48 hours of initial occupation, however, a critical set of documents, designated the Eclipse Annex Files, vanished from Allied custody. These included reports on electromagnetic field experiments, high-frequency power amplification devices, and unconventional aviation prototypes. OSS archivists noted that the disappearance coincided with a directive issued by General Dwight D. Eisenhower himself, instructing all units to consolidate recovered materials into secure storage for technical evaluation only. No records indicate the fate of the annex files, yet surviving correspondences hint at their transfer to a previously undisclosed SHAF subdepot in Luxembourg. Eyewitness accounts detail the peculiar nature of the facility's defenders. SS personnel present at the site wore non-standard uniforms with no insignia, a deviation suggesting an elite unit tasked solely with preserving the research. Several OSS operatives recalled hearing muffled discussions about a phase resonance device, a term unfamiliar to even the most technically versed intelligence officers. Attempts to interrogate the SS personnel produced only cryptic statements before they vanished under American custody, some believed to have been relocated under Project Paperclip's emerging personnel programs. Aerial reconnaissance from March to May 1945 captured fleeting images of the Tempelhof complex, but photogrammetric analysis indicates substantial modifications to the subterranean structures that did not match pre-war blueprints. Allied intelligence reports note sudden demolition work, allegedly to prevent Soviet access. However, eyewitnesses, including German civilian engineers pressed into service for the project, describe deliberate destruction only of external stairwells and non-critical access points. "They left the core intact," said one, who requested anonymity. "Nothing that could survive was destroyed above the walls. Below, that remained untouched." Correspondence recovered in 1987 through a Freedom of Information Act request provides additional insight. Several pages of the annex files surfaced with large blacked-out sections and annotations such as "sensitive, do not release, continuing operational sensitivity." Within the visible fragments, references are made to unconventional energy generators, high-voltage field manipulation, and small-scale nuclear fission experimentation. Blueprints illustrated laboratory layouts with labeled sections: electron room, resonance chamber, and containment vault alpha. Intelligence analysts later speculated that these designs were either highly experimental power systems or components of secret weaponry that could have shifted post-war military dynamics. Interviews, conducted decades later with surviving OSS officers, suggest that Operation Eclipse may have extended beyond Berlin. Orders discovered in classified US Army intelligence communiques from May 1945 mention subsequent sweeps of northern Germany, targeting facilities aligned with Project Morgenröte and associated electromagnetic initiatives. 1. Memo references the retrieval of prototype generators, designated for non-conventional propulsion and communications. Disruption. a note suggesting that the technology was considered strategic even after Nazi defeat. Additional corroboration emerged from recently declassified British War Office documents labelled SHAEF Forward Technical Assessment, 1945. These reports include handwritten notations describing advanced electrical systems capable of generating directed energy pulses, potentially influencing vehicle propulsion or communications at range. A senior analyst who examined the documents in the 1950s noted, "The terminology is consistent with German experimental physics programs, but there are aspects that defy our understanding at the time, particularly the modulation of energy fields beyond conventional circuitry." Accounts from German civilians involved in the operation paint a chilling picture. Many recalled the rapid removal of specialized equipment, large machinery transported in unmarked trucks under armed guard, crates labeled Project Morgenröte, and personnel blindfolded during transit. The civilians noted that these transports were escorted not by American soldiers alone, but occasionally by enigmatic agents wearing OSS insignia, yet speaking fluent German with unusual dialects. By May 10, 1945, the complex had been mostly cleared, and the city around it was left in ruins. But the fate of the annex files remained a carefully guarded secret. The implications of the lost files are profound. Analysts have long debated whether Operation Eclipse inadvertently laid the foundation for Cold War-era technological competition. References to energy field manipulation, advanced generator schematics, and laboratory personnel in the files hint at early experimentation that could have influenced later American and Soviet research programs. Some historians suggest that the deliberate suppression of these records was motivated not only by national security but by the desire to prevent knowledge of experimental technologies from triggering a post-war arms race. Prematurely, field logs preserved from OSS units during the operation provide additional context. Lieutenant Brenner's journal, partially declassified in 2001, mentions certain rooms contained racks of cylindrical objects, like batteries, but larger than anything we've seen. Strange markings, some in Latin characters, some in Germanic runes. The SS guarding these objects appeared to revere them. When we inquired, they only said, "Power for the future belongs to the correct hands." The disappearance of personnel associated with Operation Eclipse compounds the mystery. Several engineers and scientists present in the Tempelhof facility were absorbed into post-war American and British intelligence programs. Others reportedly died in unexplained incidents or were relocated to remote Soviet research installations. Cross-referencing SHAEF, OSS, and Soviet records yields gaps that persist to this day. In particular, no complete roster exists, and surviving names often appear in multiple intelligence networks under different identities. By combining aerial reconnaissance, eyewitness testimony, archival documents, and declassified intelligence communications, the narrative of Operation Eclipse emerges not as a simple seizure of Nazi resources, but as a calculated, multi-layered operation that erased both evidence and participants. The vanished annex files remain at the center of this enigma, a collection of research prototypes and human expertise whose disappearance arguably altered the trajectory of post-war scientific and military development. Even decades later, the impact of Operation Eclipse lingers. Analysts attempting to reconstruct the operation in the 1980s noted discrepancies in reports between American and British units, suggesting that sensitive elements were deliberately misfiled to obfuscate the scope of recovered technology. References to phase resonance devices and Project Morgenröte persisted in declassified materials only as fragments, never providing a complete picture. For modern historians and intelligence researchers, the vanished files are a symbol of wartime secrecy and the calculated erasure of knowledge, leaving unanswered questions about the reach of Nazi experimental science and the extent to which Allied powers harnessed, replicated, or concealed it in the post-war period. Chapter 3: The Siberian Repatriation Directive. In September 1945, the immediate aftermath of Japan's surrender, the vast Siberian expanse became a theater for a clandestine operation known only in scattered Soviet archives as Repatriation Directive 742. Ostensibly, its objective was to relocate German prisoners of war captured in Manchuria to labor camps throughout the Soviet Union. But intercepted NKVD communications, declassified decades later, hint at a far more sinister purpose: the establishment of a secret research enclave, combining German scientific expertise with Japanese Unit 731 personnel, for experimental biological and chemical projects. The relocation trains, each carrying hundreds of prisoners, passed through Harbin, Khabarovsk, and finally to Novosibirsk, shrouded in secrecy, under armed escort, and under strict orders that no civilian record should ever mention their passage. Railcar manifests recovered in 1993 show highly unusual entries. Sealed containers marked with cryptic alphanumeric codes, guarded by NKVD operatives. Survivor testimonies from those still alive in the early 1980s recall being blindfolded and moved through remote stations, never to interact with local populations. The secrecy was absolute. Reports from forced laborers, smuggled out decades later, describe a camp within a camp near the Ob River, complete with laboratories, experimental rooms, and fenced zones labeled A through F. Entry was strictly controlled, with heavy surveillance, guard towers, and watchdogs. Prisoners assigned to the facility were often never seen again, their fates concealed under layers of bureaucratic code. Inside the clandestine Novosibirsk complex, German scientists previously attached to the Luftwaffe's advanced research programs were reunited with Japanese specialists from Unity. 731 declassified internal NKVD reports describe the researchers' project inheritance and containing ongoing pathogen experimentation, suggesting that post-war biological weapons research continued well into the early 1950s. Field notes mention the administration of experimental inoculations, the extraction of tissue samples, and the development of aerosolized agents. The facility employed a combination of forced labor and highly trained personnel under strict compartmentalization. Only a handful of supervisors had full knowledge of the operations. Scope: radiological surveys conducted by American reconnaissance satellites in the 1950s detected unusual thermal signatures emanating from the Novosibirsk region, aligning with the period of Directive 742. Photographic evidence reveals dense security perimeters, unmarked buildings, and what appeared to be subterranean laboratories constructed beneath the surface. Archival documents also hint at a catastrophic containment breach, referred to only as Event K-17, which reportedly resulted in the relocation or disappearance of several hundred prisoners and staff. Soviet top-secret memoranda from 1951 indicate immediate sanitization of the facility and its removal from all official maps. Further complicating the historical record are surviving NKVD personnel testimonies. One former officer, interviewed under anonymity in 1990, recalled, "There were files, samples, and machines taken from Manchuria. The Japanese scientists called it their last project. The Germans called it inheritance. Nobody spoke of it openly. We moved trains under snow, fog, and night, and nothing survived outside of the complex." Allied intelligence had limited awareness of the operation. In particular, OSS reports note intercepted communications referring to German and Japanese collaboration, but the messages were fragmentary and encoded. In 1967, a Norwegian geologist researching the Ob River basin stumbled upon remains of the facility, concrete foundations, collapsed underground tunnels, and remnants of laboratories. Among the debris were jars containing partially decomposed biological specimens, vials labeled in both German and Japanese, and documents referencing airborne dissemination protocols. Attempts to publish the findings drew attention from Soviet diplomatic channels, and the geologist's notes were seized and remain classified. Cross-referencing declassified Soviet and American intelligence reports suggests that Directive 742 was not limited to Novosibirsk. Similar facilities may have existed near Krasnoyarsk and Irkutsk, forming a network of isolated laboratories. Several trains, each marked with coded identifiers, traversed frozen landscapes under NKVD escort, carrying high-priority prisoners and experimental cargo. One undated US intelligence report from 1947 notes, "Movement patterns suggest facilities are interlinked and operating under a central command. Reconnaissance confirms substantial underground installations. Survivor accounts provide haunting details of life within the facility. Prisoners described being forced into cold, windowless chambers, with strict schedules for sample collection, mechanical experiments, and compliance drills. Medical experiments reportedly included exposure to pathogens under controlled conditions, thermal and chemical testing, and the application of novel surgical procedures without anesthesia. Observers consistently noted the removal of any casualties, often during the night, with no documentation other than NKVD internal logs marked Disposal Directive Compliance. The long-term impact of Directive 742 is evident in both scientific and military contexts. German engineers and Japanese researchers later appeared in Western and Soviet research programs under new identities, contributing unknowingly to Cold War bioweapons initiatives. Analysis of declassified OSS and CIA files confirms that intelligence agencies were aware of the program but had only partial information. Direct confrontation or intervention was deemed too risky. The Siberian terrain, Soviet security, and the potential for mass casualties prevented external oversight. In modern investigations, fragments of the program's documentation provide chilling insight. Laboratory schematics, vials labeled with experimental codes, and cryptic correspondences hint at projects that straddled the line between medicine and mass destruction. Internal NKVD evaluations, later declassified, mention the necessity of complete isolation to prevent contamination and intelligence compromise, indicating a level of operational secrecy unprecedented in Soviet post-war management. Directive 742's legacy is the shadow it cast on post-war geopolitics. The convergence of German and Japanese scientific expertise in remote Siberia, combined with NKVD control, not only delayed public knowledge of the operation, but also likely influenced the early Cold War balance of technological and biological capabilities. Though its full scope remains obscured by decades of censorship, surviving evidence paints a picture of meticulous planning, ruthless enforcement, and a deliberate erasure of witnesses. The Siberian Repatriation Directive remains a chilling testament to the hidden intersections of war, science, and human suffering. In the snowbound reaches of Novosibirsk, Krasnoyarsk, and surrounding territories, history quietly bore witness to experiments, disappearances, and the manipulation of knowledge for purposes never fully acknowledged, leaving behind fragments that continue to perplex historians, intelligence analysts, and researchers 75 years later. Chapter 4. The Adriatic Listening Posts. By late 1946, Europe was recovering from the devastation of the Second World War, but a new, invisible conflict had begun. The shadow war of signals, interception, and covert observation. Along the Dalmatian coast of Yugoslavia, the British Secret Intelligence Service established a network of listening posts intended to monitor Soviet and Yugoslav naval movements. Codenamed Vigilance Bay, one of the most ambitious installations was located on an uninhabited island near Vis. The station was disguised as a weather observation outpost, but in reality it housed experimental radar, equipment and high-frequency radio interception, systems capable of penetrating what were then considered secure Soviet naval communications. Construction began in the winter of 1944. During the final months of German occupation, using a combination of Allied engineers, forced local labor, and captured German technicians familiar with radar technology. According to declassified GCHQ intercept logs, by January 1947, the station was fully operational, emitting faint, irregular pulses intended to map submarine movements along the Adriatic. These transmissions were designed to be undetectable by conventional monitoring, but, as later records indicate, they inadvertently interfered with civilian communications and even disrupted local magnetic instruments aboard passing Yugoslav vessels. The equipment included a radar dome measuring 12 meters in diameter, linked to a network of buried cables, and a clandestine power supply drawn from the island's limited hydroelectric infrastructure. Inside the dome, operators rotated large parabolic antennas while monitoring CRT screens displaying complex waveforms. The station's chief engineer, Lieutenant Colonel Arthur Sinclair, maintained meticulous logs of intercepted signals, noting patterns that suggested Soviet vessels were adjusting patrol routes in response to previously undetected electronic surveillance. Sinclair's reports, later discovered in the National Archives in 1989, reference anomalies such as molecular level, signal interference, and unexpected frequency. Reflections, terminology, that remained classified for decades due to its potential military implications. In 1950, the island's outpost vanished almost entirely. Official Royal Navy reports claimed destruction from storm damage and the abandonment of equipment, but multiple eyewitness accounts, including that of Croatian fisherman Marko Petrovic, suggest otherwise. Petrovic described seeing a sudden, intense flash over the radar dome one night, followed by a period of total radio silence. When naval inspectors arrived, They found melted aluminum fragments fused to components of RAF-issue flight suits and scattered debris inconsistent with natural weather phenomena. A secret MI6 memorandum later noted that the site had experienced an unplanned release of electromagnetic energy, resulting in the loss of operational equipment. The disappearance extended to personnel. Some engineers were reassigned to other classified radar projects within the United Kingdom, while others were never accounted for. In correspondence recovered from declassified 1952 files, MI6 officer Geoffrey Langley remarked, "The personnel files do not match actual deployment. It is as if the island was scrubbed from operational history. Attempts by independent researchers to map the original layout in subsequent decades revealed that even aerial photographs from the 1940s had been modified or removed from official archives. Local civilian witnesses reported strange occurrences in the vicinity of the former installation. Fishermen described lights oscillating across the island at irregular intervals and faint hums audible above the Adriatic waves. Metal detectors recovered fragments of unidentifiable alloys and circuitry embedded in rock formations. These anomalies led some analysts to hypothesize that the experimental radar systems may have been interacting with atmospheric conditions or inadvertently generating localized electrical discharges, producing effects strong enough to distort physical materials. Technical documents later unearthed in British National Archives detail the nature of the experimental transmissions. Engineers referred to frequency phase modulation capable of remote detection, which, if replicated, could influence mechanical and communication systems over a limited radius. A 1973 MI6 internal memorandum confirms signals emitted interfered with Soviet communications at the molecular level, warranting immediate termination and security sweep. The reference implies that the technology had operational effects beyond simple signal interception, potentially even affecting nearby electronic or mechanical systems. Archival intelligence suggests the operation was more extensive than a single island installation. Multiple listening posts were established across the Adriatic chain, forming a covert observation network intended to track Soviet naval redeployments and Yugoslav coastal fortifications. Transmission logs indicate coordinated operation with Mediterranean-based Royal Navy ships, as well as liaison with the American SIGINT division monitoring Eastern Bloc naval communications. Several decrypted messages refer to the experimental dome on Vis as the primary node in an intelligence circuit that extended across the region. Despite its disappearance, Vigilance Bay's impact endured. Soviet intelligence reports from 1951 referenced unaccounted interference along the Adriatic coast, noting disrupted communications, sporadic sonar echoes, and anomalous readings among submarine crews. The British continued to monitor the area via other clandestine installations, but the VS outpost remained the most sophisticated and mysterious site. In technical evaluations conducted in the 1960s, analysts speculated that the abandoned equipment may have permanently altered local electromagnetic patterns, creating residual interference still detectable decades later. The disappearance of both the equipment and personnel fueled speculation among historians and intelligence analysts. Was Vigilance Bay the result of a catastrophic experimental mishap? Or did it serve as an early warning system for the Allies, capable of influencing enemy operations through unconventional means? Declassified MI6 reports hint that operational security measures included deliberate obfuscation of all traces, making future observation by adversaries impossible. The documents further describe a system of coded logs and false telemetry intended to mislead Soviet monitoring, raising the possibility that the disappearance was partially orchestrated as a deception measure. Interviews with surviving engineers conducted in the late 1980s reveal that the technology employed was unprecedented for its time. Among them, engineer Peter Hawthorne recalled, "We were working on modulation levels that had no precedent. I cannot discuss the precise parameters, but the waves we emitted behaved as though they had weight. The Soviets were the first to detect some effect, but we never fully understood the physics ourselves." These testimonies suggest that Vigilance Bay was not merely a listening post, but an experimental platform pushing the boundaries of radar and signal intelligence into uncharted territory. Even today, the island remains restricted under Croatian law, with limited access to both the original site and remaining infrastructure. Researchers attempting to map historical coordinates have repeatedly encountered anomalies in satellite imagery and topographic records, indicating ongoing government sensitivity. Metal fragments, melted components, and hidden chambers occasionally discovered suggest that a portion of the facility may still be intact, buried beneath layers of rock and reinforced concrete. The story of the Adriatic listening posts exemplifies the hidden dimensions of early Cold War intelligence. What began as a straightforward SIGINT operation became a high-stakes experiment in electronic warfare, technological experimentation, and extreme operational secrecy. For decades, the island near Vis has remained a locus of intrigue, its true capabilities and incidents largely erased from public record. Historians and former intelligence officers continue to puzzle over how far the technology may have extended its influence, and whether traces of Vigilance Bay's mysterious transmissions still resonate in the Adriatic waters. Chapter 5: Echoes from the Iron Mountain. In the immediate aftermath of Germany's surrender in May 1945, Allied reconnaissance flights over the Bavarian Alps identified a series of previously uncharted tunnels and industrial complexes buried beneath the mountains near Füssen. Official records labeled the facility Object 12B, but locals soon referred to it as the Iron Mountain. Allied intelligence initially believed the site to be a conventional munitions depot or subterranean armaments factory, yet what they discovered suggested far greater significance. Reconnaissance photographs revealed extensive rail networks, hydroelectric conduits, and reinforced subterranean halls that had been evacuated weeks prior to occupation. On the surface, no personnel remained. Underground, evidence hinted at a well-organized exfiltration of both materials and human expertise. Inside the facility, crates stamped with coded alphanumeric sequences and runic markings were left behind, many containing technical blueprints and advanced mechanical components. US intelligence reports from May 1946 describe hundreds of documents labeled under ambiguous titles such as Project Omega and Operation Überlast, accompanied by machinery of unknown function. Engineers involved in post-war excavation efforts noted the sophistication of the underground construction. Blast doors, nearly 3 meters thick, ventilation systems designed to support large numbers of personnel, and electrical wiring of unusually high capacity. Several top-secret OSS assessments suggested that the design could support sustained industrial and research activity independent of surface. Infrastructure eyewitness testimonies indicate that SS engineers had coordinated closely with American liaison under Project Paperclip prior to evacuation, creating an ambiguous post-war relationship. The integration of German and Allied personnel in the site's final days is documented in partially declassified files, suggesting deliberate preparation for the transfer of both knowledge and materials. The US Army's Special Technical Projects Division classified these operations as critical to national security, noting that several leading German engineers were relocated to US military research laboratories, effectively erasing them from European historical records. Exploration of the tunnels in late 1946 revealed heavy machinery still in place, alongside stenciled warnings in German and English: "Do not reconnect. Phase resonance active." These warnings suggested the presence of experimental equipment capable of generating energy fields or mechanical vibrations of unknown magnitude. American intelligence analysts interpreted these markings as indicative of research into early energy resonance systems, possibly linked to propulsion or power amplification experiments. Reports also referenced Project Inheritance, implying that the site contained knowledge or devices intended to be absorbed into post-war technological programs rather than destroyed or abandoned. Subsequent field reports described the meticulous removal of sensitive items. Crates containing experimental electrical components, mechanical schematics, and personnel files were loaded onto military transport vehicles under strict guard. By 1947, all recoverable materials had been relocated, yet portions of the site remained largely untouched, perhaps due to the complexity or instability of the remaining equipment. Local testimonies recount strange phenomena: unexplained hums within tunnels, residual radiation readings, and unusual magnetic disturbances near the reinforced areas. Scientists and engineers documenting these anomalies in classified reports suggested the presence of energy fields that persisted despite the removal of power sources. Internal communications between OSS operatives and the US Army Corps of Engineers reveal concerns about accidental reactivation. Memoranda from 1948 note that the tunnels contained machinery capable of initiating high-voltage resonance with minimal input, potentially causing structural collapse or unexplained electrical surges. As a precaution, certain areas were sealed and mapped only in restricted military documents. Attempts by civilian spelunkers or researchers to access the complex in subsequent decades were met with both physical obstacles and legal restrictions, reinforcing the site's secrecy. The human dimension of Iron Mountain adds further complexity. Personnel evacuated from the facility included engineers, technicians, and scientists who later contributed to US and NATO research projects. Many were provided new identities, integrated into defense contracting positions, or reassigned to laboratories with compartmentalized knowledge. Cross-referencing intelligence files indicates that some individuals involved in Object 12B later appeared in early Cold War experiments related to nuclear testing, aeronautics, and advanced materials research. The degree to which the Iron Mountain technology directly influenced these programs remains unclear due to extensive redactions in surviving documentation. Archival material recovered in the 1990s includes partial blueprints, machinery diagrams, and coded logbooks, suggesting that the site was capable of independent research and manufacturing at a scale sufficient to support advanced experimentation. Engineers who accessed the complex during the post-war period described heavy cylindrical devices, electrical coils, and what appeared to be resonance chambers, rooms designed to contain energy oscillations of considerable magnitude. Several notes reference phase, calibration units, and resonance coupling modules, indicating that the experiments may have involved the manipulation of energy waves or vibration frequencies beyond conventional understanding. At the time, one particularly revealing document, recovered from the US Army Technical Intelligence Archive, describes a transport of materials from Object 12B to a classified research facility in New Mexico in early 1946. Items included partially completed mechanical devices, large metal coils, and crates labeled Project Omega, Do Not Energize. This aligns with reports from local German civilians who recalled seeing trucks with American and German personnel departing the site at night, often under escort from armored vehicles. Such movements suggest a deliberate strategy to transfer experimental knowledge and physical components out of Europe entirely, ensuring their preservation under Allied control. Reports of unexplained phenomena persisted long after the evacuation. In 1991, Austrian spelunkers reported faint, low-frequency hums within abandoned tunnels, alongside residual metallic structures that appeared to have been altered by high-voltage processes. Pieces of equipment were fused together, and walls were scorched with patterns inconsistent with natural causes. Investigators speculated that either the machinery had been reactivated inadvertently or residual energy from prior experiments remained, a phenomenon still poorly understood. Access to these areas remains restricted, and official Austrian documentation classifies the region as a natural hazard zone. The Iron Mountain narrative illustrates the convergence of science, secrecy, and strategic foresight. Beyond its immediate military significance, Object 12B represents the deliberate preservation and relocation of knowledge capable of influencing the technological trajectory of the post-war world. It is both a testament to meticulous engineering under wartime pressure and a stark reminder of the clandestine operations that defined the early stages of the Cold War. The remnants of Iron Mountain, though largely inaccessible, continue to offer fragmented evidence of experiments that were erased from the public record, but may have shaped decades of military and scientific development in ways still unacknowledged. Decades after the guns fell silent and the borders were redrawn, the shadows of these operations still linger. Ghost convoys lie buried beneath the Baltic. Annex files remain partially erased from archives, and Siberian labs whisper of experiments that may have shaped the Cold War. Listening posts vanished without a trace, and the Iron Mountain's hidden machinery hums only in memory and speculation. What other secrets were moved, destroyed, or concealed? And how much of modern technology rests on foundations we may never fully see? The past refuses closure, and each revelation opens new corridors of uncharted history, inviting further investigation and unsettling discovery.